Okay, it's showtime according to YouTube, so off we go. I have the great pleasure of presenting a scholar who I personally have admired for a number of years, who works in areas that I also touch in my own work, Latin America and digital humanities, who's Ms. Ortega, Dr. Elika Ortega. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Culture, Societies, and Global Studies and core faculty at the NU Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks at Northeastern University. Elika writes about digital literature, not necessarily digital media, literature and also not necessarily digital media, cultural hybridity, materiality, reading practices and interfaces, books, networks, digital humanities, and multilingualism in academia. Her projects include a handbook of e-literature reading, e-lit reading, an archive of instructions to read electronic literature works, and binding media, print digital literature from the 1980s to 2010s. Her monograph investigating print digital works of literature from hemispheric perspective, which was the aforementioned binding media. She was the program director and co-chair for Digital Humanities 2018 in Mexico City, and she's currently editing a special issue of DSH of conference papers. She's also part of the executive committee of the TC Digital Humanities at the MLA and the Association for Computers and the Humanities Executive Council Officer. Her talk today is entitled Hybrid Works, the Digital Humanities and Hemispheric Approaches. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecily. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here this afternoon, to Michael Sinatra for the invitation, to Cecily for the introduction, and I'm truly honored to be here and very excited to present this work to you. So this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about the book project that I'm writing currently, that is entitled Binding Media, Print Digital Literature, 1980s to 2010s. I'm going to divide the presentation into roughly 4 parts. First, I'm going to describe the phenomenon that I call binding media and show some of the examples in the corpus I examine. Then I'm going to make an argument for how these constitute examples of hybrid media, and further why we can consider them a manifestation of cultural hybridity as well. And finally, I'll make some rather speculative proposals as to why this approach offers fruitful avenues for thinking about digital humanities. So I'm just going to dive in. There is no shortage of ways in which the print and the digital intersect within the literary realm. Though still a recurrent trope, the print and digital binary has proven as unproductive as that of the old and the new when discussing contemporary literature and media. Indeed, as Matt Kirschenbaum has shown us, the instances in which print and digital move around each other at all stages of the lifespan of a literary work, from its writing to its reviewing, are so intricately woven together that attempting to talk about print without the digital seems nearly impossible. More than providing confirmation of the death of the book or the decline of literary reading, as many have lamented, the present moment, full of intersections between print and digital, offers a wealth of evidence that reveals a still unstable landscape where new models of creation, production, and consumption have flourished and continue to prosper, both as standards and as experimental endeavors around the world. There are many particular instances in which we can observe the tensions of the encounter of print and digital, such as platform variants, that is, platform variants in ebooks, that is, when the same file renders or displays differently according to reading software, the ubiquity of desktop publishing software, fan fiction, print-on-demand initiatives, among others. One specific manifestation of these intersections caught my attention a few years ago, and it is the center of the project that I'm writing right now. It consists of literary works, fiction, poetry, and essay that bind print and digital media. The phenomenon of binding media I propose encompasses works published simultaneously or sequentially as both a codex and some kind of digital application. The metaphor of binding I use is borrowed from print and even manuscript tradition, where the binding is not only the structure that holds together the individual page units into a codex, but also is an organizing and coherence principle. In the hybrid print-digital works, the binding is such structural and organizing mechanism that binds the distributed objects of a work. The first of such examples that I came across with was Amaranth Borsuk and Brad Bau's Between Page and Screen in 2012, shortly after it was published by Siglio Press. Some of you may know this work. Show your hands if you know. But for those of you who don't, here's a short video of Borsuk presenting the work itself at some other conference. So there's no audio in this video, but I can walk you through it. So what we have in this example of Between Page and Screen is a work that is all of its pages contains only sort of codes that resemble QR codes, and the way to read the textual content of the book is to show it to the webcam through an augmented reality engine that reveals the words that you are seeing on the screen right now. So I can let it play for a little bit. And then when the QR code goes away from the scope of the webcam, it kind of explodes. The letters sort of explode. Reviews and essays about Between Page and Screen, boasted and celebrated its newness and the possibilities of augmented reality engines to transform and reinvent the practice of poetry reading and writing. In a work like Between Page and Screen, it is possible to observe how the work's meaning is created in a matrix of human and machine languages, print and digital media objects, and crucially, the reader's handling of the many pieces. The seemingly empty space between recognizable objects turns out to be the very material holding the items together, what I'm calling the binding of the work. While print novels and poetry collections and electronic literature works may have echoes or connections to one another, in a work like Between Page and Screen, those relationships are inside out. To continue with the binding metaphor, these works show the seams of bringing print and digital objects together, just like the stitches, end bands, and ribbons join signatures in a print volume. And that was my slide of the binding, by the way. Here it is. I rapidly found a small corpus of works that analogously bind print and digital media. Among them were Ian Bogo's The Slow Year from 2010. This is a collection of Atari-like game poems and machine-generated haikus. Another example is Stephanie Strickland's Universe from 2011, and then 2016, when the iPad app was released, a collection of poems and sort of animated poems, interactive poems in the iPad. There's also Jacob Garby and Aaron Reed's Icebound from 2015. This is an augmented reality, sort of like choose your own adventures, choose your own narrative novel. And also J.R. Carpenter's The Gathering Cloud from just last year. Though this short list makes the phenomenon of binding media look like a radically contemporary one, not older than this decade, this turned out to be not the case. As research progressed, and I should mention that research has been really interesting because there is no really systematic way of finding hybrid works in a library catalog or even in electronic literature catalogs. So it's been basically by going to collections like Dini Grigor's Electronic Literature Lab, to Laurie Emerson's Media Archaeology Lab, and to Matt Kirschenbaum's collection at the MIT Institute for Technology in the Humanities. So it's really, they're really not easy to find. But as research has progressed, it's become evident that this is a much older phenomenon. So some of the earlier examples that I've been able to trace include Robert Pinsky's Mind Wheel, an electronic novel from 1984 that was created in collaboration with Steve Hales and William Mataga. And then in 1986, something seems to happen, and we have examples like Paul Selewansky, the case for the Boreal of Ancestors, and Thomas Disch's Amnesia, published at around the same time, as well as Judy Malloy's Uncle Roger, also from 1986. William Gibson's Agrippa, A Book of the Dead, came out to instant fame in 1992. And this is one of the paradigmatic examples of this kind of work, where we see, as you probably know, the electronic poem was contained a piece of code that erased it as soon as it played, and similarly the book was printed with photosensitive ink that would erase through usage and through exposure to light. This male-heavy list of American pioneers of binding media might give the impression that this is a phenomenon proper, though not exclusive to the Anglo-American region. This is a phenomenon, the distinction of having mostly American writers be the pioneers of this kind of phenomenon, can be readily attributed to the developing market around the world, but especially in Latin America, the region that I'm most familiar with, of computational technologies and digital devices that up until the 1990s, when the US started to establish free trade agreements, was dramatically affected by hefty import taxes and considerable differences in exchange rates. Nevertheless, dating back to the same era is one surprising example outside of the US that is worth mentioning: William Flusser's hypertextual version of the novel Die Schrift, published in 1987. In Matrix, the publisher responsible for both the print and the digital editions indicated in an insert that is translated in the William Flusser archive online that said, "You decided to take part in an experiment of developing new dimensions of communication. In front of you lies the first real, no longer a book." End of quote. A much broader map of the phenomenon emerges precisely in the decade of the 1990s, and again, let's remember this, kind of like surge in free trade agreements that I think are perhaps responsible for it. And on to the turn of the century, works that were in the making through the mid and late 90s, like, for example, Luis Bravo, Arbol Veloz, a Norwegian writer, the Brazilian artist and writer Gisele Belgelmans, The Book After the Book, O Libro Depois do Libro, that was published in 1999 and 2003, and El Libro del Fin del Mundo by Belén Gache from Argentina, 1996 and 2002. Another great example that I like mentioning, but I don't have any images because it's so rare that I haven't been able to even look at it, but I have documentation that it exists, is a remaking of Augusto de Campos' poem Now as a print book, accompanied by a CD-ROM, including what he calls clip poem, and so animated poems of his concrete poetry. That is really, really exciting. Further, although I'm not able to read them because I'm unfortunately not fluent or at all capable in Polish, there's the two works by the Polish writer Zenon Pfeiffer's. I'm not even going to try to read that and butcher it, from 2010, and this other one from 2013. This collection, of which the examples that I'm showing is really only a handful, currently in the corpus, I have close to 50 examples of this, and suddenly, I always find myself coming to new examples every time I go to visit a new collection. But anyway, so this is only a fraction of the corpus that I've gathered. But I believe that this collection has evidence that this kind of experimentation is the product of a media transitional moment that is very interestingly manifesting in strikingly similar ways at different moments and at a scale that we can consider to be global. These works, as you can see from the quick survey that I showed, share very little in common. among the things that we can mention is the mix of machine and human language. Especially in the Latin American examples, there's a lot of bilingualism present in the publications, usually available at least both in Portuguese and English, or English and Spanish, but sometimes in more as well. And finally, that they all propose very particular and very specific reading conditions. Their commonality, I argue, is the hybrid material constitution and the fact that each of them has established mechanisms that bind the two objects together by, for example, literary means like narrative sequence. In this case, of Paul Selewansky's work, the game that we have in the floppy disk that is called Swallows constitutes one of the chapters within the whole work. There's also the bibliographic means like page design, where we have in this case from Gatche's work that little icon indicating the reader to now go to the disk. And then by technical means as well, like is the case of augmented reality. All of these mechanisms, which are ultimately enacted by the reader, are the principle that links the works in the corpus together across rather diverse literary practices, discontinuous media historical developments, and national, regional, or linguistic literary traditions. They're a sort of topos, let's call it for now. Further, this type of work reviews the tensions between media, specific modes of reading and writing, the stability of the codex, and the rapid changing landscape of digital technologies and storage media, experimental writing and bookmaking, and trade publishing as well. This makes it possible to take binding media works as the archaeological remains of the still ongoing novelty years, transitional states, and the identity crisis of media, to use Lisa Gittleman's words, in the specific realm of literary creation. That's what I was saying right now. So now we're going to move on to the subject of media hybridity within the ideas of media ecologies. The intersection of print and digital media and its complicated topologies and histories have prompted a number of theoretical approaches in the last few decades. Areas of studies like specific media analysis or comparative textual media, the post-digital, media archaeology, which have been accompanied by terminologies like the post-web, the post-internet, the new aesthetic, intermediation or intermediality, transmediality, convergence media, etc., have sought to characterize our historical media moment. The proliferation of approaches is suggestive not only of the many ways the two media realms intersect, but also of a difficulty in systematizing their diversity. Two very closely related frameworks help explain this diversity. On the one hand, Neil Postman's 1993 Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology, where he sustains that, and I quote him, technological change is neither additive nor subtractive, it is ecological. One significant change generates total change. And this notion is echoed by Catherine House in her groundbreaking Writing Machines from 2002. For her, she says, in the entangled web of media ecology, change anywhere in the system stimulates change everywhere in the system. In Writing Machines, furthermore, Hales proposes the approach of media-specific analysis as a way to move from, and I quote him, the language of text to a more precise vocabulary of screen and page, digital program and analog interface, code and ink, mutable image and durable mark, computer and book, end quote. It's important to know that specificity does not have to do with looking at particular media in isolation, but, as she says, and I quote her again, constantly engaging in a recursive dynamic of imitating each other, incorporating aspects of competing media into themselves, while simultaneously flaunting the advantages their own forms of mediation offer, end quote. Hale's approach is instrumental to defamiliarize the unacknowledged assumptions around print and literature. Side by side with technological developments in the last decades and the 20th century, print becomes one in a long list of inscription technologies like telegraphy, film, video, nanotechnology, and of course the computer. This is interesting because the Multigraph Collective, who recently published the Interacting with Print book, make a very similar claim where they say changes in one medium, and this is almost a copy of Postman's and Hale's, changes in one medium produce changes in all others, just as the introduction of a new medium or its rapid growth produces changes in the others. Postman, Hales, and others' media ecological thinking bring us within an inch of talking about media hybridity. Indeed, I believe the notion of hybridity is adjacent or complementary to this scholar's thinking on systemic transformation and change, even if it does not get conceptualized as such. Hale's examination of specific examples that she calls technotexts suggests this hybridity. And as a matter of fact, the notion of hybridity does not get an elaboration in media studies, I believe, until we start seeing the conceptualizations of the post-digital. And for example, in his widely anthologized article, What is the Post-Digital?, Florian Kramer characterizes the post-digital as, and I'm quoting him, a perspective on digital information technology, which no longer focuses on technological innovation or improvement, and continue quoting him, a perspective emerging out of the state of affairs after the initial upheaval caused by the computerization and global digital networking of communication, technical infrastructures, markets, and geopolitics. Over this basis, Kramer characterizes practices like, and you may know this, like the work of the roving typist, this person who sits in Central Park in New York with a typewriter and writes in situ stories that he later tweets, I believe, and the DIY and maker movements as post-digital hybrids of old and new media. A more narrowed down approach of the post-digital to print and publishing can be found in Alessandro Ludovico's post-digital print, The Mutation of Publishing since 1894. Excuse me. Tracing several historical episodes where print has been at risk, Ludovico readily acknowledges that the role of the printed page has radically mutated from being a prevalent medium in its own right to being a complementary medium. Further, Ludovico identifies a number of underground printing scenes and art books that are pretty much a parallel development to the binding media works that I study. Some of the most noteworthy ones are Lunch, Blender, and Blam, all of which included materials either in floppy disks or in CD-ROMs, and which are unfortunately pretty much impossible to trace these days. The multiple transitions he traces entail further interaction, integration, and mixing. Ultimately, Ludovico writes, book publishing will be able to make use of various old and new media without the burden of ideological affiliation to any particular one of them, and will be surely in a position to develop new and truly hybrid publications by creatively combining the best standards and interfaces of both digital and print. Ludovico's idea of the true hybrid seems to suggest a slighter scale of intersections that I don't quite agree with. It gets a little perhaps too specific as to what constitutes full hybridity and what would be kind of satellite to it. As a matter of fact, if we look at the multiple ways in which the works I presented a few minutes ago bind the print codex and an assortment of digital applications, the most appealing quality of the corpus is not that it allows for a categorization of which is most hybrid, but how hybridity takes many forms. In the ecologies described by Postman and Hales, what we see is a myriad ways in which changes and transformations take place. It is true that the emergence of new forms has been theorized, like I do with the examples I presented before, in very circumscribed ways, little change by little change. But given that there is a wealth not just of intersections between print and digital, but also a diversity in theoretical and critical approaches like those I mentioned, I think it is time to look at them in tandem as a broader reaching cultural phenomenon. This takes me to the second part. The instability and structuredness of the many manifestations of media hybridity that are possible both in the media ecology described by Postman and Hales and on my corpus can be best examined and understood along the basis of studies of cultural hybridity. This position leads me to think that at the turn of the 21st century, in our globalized and hyper-connected world, cultural and media hybridity are best seen as a continuum. Though not dealing directly with media or literature, in his classic book, Hybrid Cultures, the Argentinian-Mexican cultural critic Nestor Garcia Canclini has identified a similar dynamic when he states that globalizing processes accentuate modern cross-cultural contact by creating world markets for money, material goods, messages, and migrants. End quote. Binding media works are the result of the encounters between media and among cultures taking place at the juncture of transnational and transcultural exchanges, fostered and furthered by media shift. Giselle Bergman, in the book after the book, might have been one of the first artists to make this connection and include it in her work. And this is a tiny, just a tiny section where she very clearly states the idea of cultural hybridity that exists between books and bytes, so books and digital applications. It is not hard to see that works like, for example, Belén Gache's El libro del fin del mundo are such kinds of hybrids. And I'm gonna let the video play a little bit so you can see a little bit of the navigation next to the page that is leading us to that section. Canclini's characterization of hybridity is useful here again. He says that hybridity are, and I quote him again, sociocultural processes in which discrete structures or practices previously existing in separate form are combined to generate new structures, objects, and practices. Now, in the case of Gache's work, aside from the CD-ROM inside the book kind of publishing model that I showed in the first image of it, we also have this very intriguing, sort of manicule, digital manicule existing, for which there is actually no bibliographic descriptor. I've been trying to work towards that, but that is a very interesting, though very simple, perhaps, example of how these new forms sort of emerge, for which neither scholarship nor regular readers have a precedent for. And it is indeed the biking mechanism, let's call it the little stitch of it. A similar thing happens with Begelman's, again, with the book after the book, which I'll let play too, where we see not an opposition in a way between print and digital, but a conceptual reconfiguration of how they overlap, where they come into contact. This practice is also highly resonant of Joshua Lund's own characterization of hybridity as, and I quote him, a critique of teleology, not a dialectical contradiction to be resolved in synthesis, but palimpsestically, layered and linked in a schema that signals a contemporary as a constant reconfiguration of old and new. So this is very interesting because one of the proposals that Begelman makes in her book is not at all a succession of things or a resolution of things, but the overlap and the sort of layer existence or modular existence of all of the media that she touches, and several distributed across websites and across book, and in an almost Bakhtinian kind of fashion across kind of like the history of all literature and of all literary theory as well. Indeed, Begelman herself sees the current media moment as a zone of friction, full of reversions, connections, and migrations. Migration here obviously has to do with technical migrations, like from one database to another, but it is not just that. as we've become painfully aware in the last few years, migration really ends up touching every single aspect of life, and has resonances that are sometimes hard to foresee until they start happening. And so is the case with these kinds of works. This is J.R. Carpenter's Etheric Ocean, that is a collection of the print instances of several digital works, like the one that is playing on the left, that is Etheric Ocean. And I mentioned her because she has recently spoken about this idea of migration, both physical human migration, but also in terms of media and a sense of in-betweenness. She says, I'm gonna quote her. She says, "I am a migrant. Almost every aspect of my daily life involves some aspect of translation, transfer, transition. In an ocean of static, I'm trying to think about migration not as a transition from one place to another, but rather as a condition of being in between places. I approach this partly by evoking other non-human systems which reside in between spaces, digital networks, ocean currents, birds, beaches, and wind." And further, this book, An Ocean of Static, is a transitional object. It operates between human and machine languages, times and spaces, between archives and live voices. The in-betweenness identified by Carpenter bears strong echoes to the notion of contact zone, first proposed by Mary Louise Pratt to talk about cultural encounters and travel narratives, and later on by Alan Liu to characterize narratives of media shift. And this is where I think that the link between media hybridity and cultural hybridity really come together. And you'll excuse me, I'm gonna indulge in a little bit of almost collation sort of exercise right now, where I try to draw the parallels between Pratt's thinking about zone of contact in a cultural setting and Alan Liu in a media setting. So we have on the one hand the historical transitions and media. And Mary Louise Pratt says, important historical transitions alter the way people write because they alter people's experiences and the way people imagine, feel, and think about the world they live in. The shifts in writing, then, will tell you something about the nature of those changes. And very similarly, I think, Liu says, narratives of media encounter in the form of first contact with the word, book, law, image, music, and more recently code are deeply embedded in the entire historiography of early modern religious or imperial conquest, enlightenment, and industrial modernization, etc. Another parallelism that is very interesting is the conceptualization of the contact zone itself. For Pratt, she says, it invokes the space and time where subjects previously separated by geography and history are co-present, the point at which their trajectories now intersect. And Liu says, the premise is that the boundary between codex-based literature and digital information has now been so bridged by shared technological, communicational, and computational protocols that we might best think in terms of an encounter rather than a border. And the last one, the phenomena that emerge out of that context zone for Pratt is multiple cultural formations or forms of cultural capital are in play, the regional, the national, and the metropolitan or universal. Artists find creative possibilities in ingeniously entangling and superimposing this. Again, the overlap and the palimpsest. And for Liu, I think an unpredictable zone of contact, more borderland than borderline, where misunderstandings of new media are negotiated along twisting, partial, and contradictory vectors. So very interesting parallelisms in my mind that really spark the imagination of and the argument of seeing this cultural encounter and media, cultural hybridity and media hybridity as a continuum. Similarly, and just to kind of like, bring the point even closer to home, Canclini argues hybridization in a certain way has become easier and more prolific at a time when it does not rely on long periods of artisanal or erudite patience, but rather turns on the ability to generate hypertext and quickly produce audiovisual or electronic publications. The thread we can weave between the notions put forward by Pratt, Liu, and Canclini invite us to reflect upon the major cultural changes taking place around and underneath the media shift from print to digital, not just the technological or market developments that underlie said media shift. For Pratt, it was clear that the arts of the contact zone, as she calls them, reflected the larger cultural changes taking place in the 16th through the 18th century. In a similar fashion, we can say that, among others, where print and digital intersect, literary works binding media codify and enact these changes that we've been seeing at least since the 1980s. I should say at this point too that what I'm referring to critics who have focused on the Latin American region right now, very similar sorts of theorizations exist in post-colonial thinking via Homi Bhabha, Stuart Hall, and others. And in the larger project, of course, I consider them, since I think that the dialogue between post-colonial studies and cultural hybridity in Latin America have much to tell each other, and it's something that hasn't happened enough yet. All right, getting close to the end. So why this matters to the digital humanities? So to conclude, I'm going to move into the realm of a little bit of speculative thinking, in part because the book is not finished yet, so some conclusions I still have to get to. And in part because I think the problem that I'm trying to address is still in constant movement and in development. But I think it is suggestive of at least 3 points that I want to make. The first, so if, and this may be a big if, what I'm arguing is valid, that at the turn of the 21st century, in our globalized and hyper-connected world, cultural and media encounter are best seen as a continuum, then the digital humanities is one instance of this hybridity that is taking place, on the one hand, through the myriad sort of hybrid praxis that we have, but it is also enacting it, for example, in teaching, in creating new programs and degrees, as well as new publication platforms like Manifold, let's say. Second, as I've tried to show in my examples, the hemispheric dimension of the corpus I'm researching, spanning the American continent, but which is likely broader than that, is revelatory of the connections, coincidences, analogies, or topoi, if we want to use the media archaeological term, that take place in various regions at various times because of the dynamics precipitated by the proliferation of digital technologies. For Eric Hutamo, topoi seems to transcend specific historical context, and I may add geographic and linguistic as well. And he also says, topoi should be researched as symptoms of both cultural continuities and ruptures. In fact, although the topos of the assaults on the book has a long history, as you know, I wonder how long the current instantiation of these topos is going to continue to go on, and how long it's going to be useful to find connections across cultures. And finally, in her recent book, Reader Come Home, the neuroscientist and scholar of reading, Marianne Wolf, imagines the emergence of a biliteral reading brain. The biliteral reading brain, she says, resembles the bilingual or multilingual brains that can operate at will in each of the registers, English, French, Spanish, depending on the context. The biliteral brain, consequently, does this shift in reading registers of practices depending on the context given by platform, print and digital, with its very specific demands for attention and information processing. Works binding media, like the ones you just saw, may well be doing that. And although they may seem to exist in the experimental literature world at times, it may be the case, as Jesus Martín Barbero posited, somewhat poetically, only in literature does mestiçage cease to be an abstract theme and become a living actor who speaks with a distinctive way of perceiving, narrating, and being aware of the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Erika. So we do have some time for questions. If you're willing to take them, yes. So who would like to begin with the question? Yes.
I really like your talk. It was very interesting.
Thank
I
you.
have two questions. First of all, regarding the metaphor of binding, I find it a bit paradoxical since, like, in the 90s, the big thing about like hyperfiction, electronic literature was like unbinding, getting text outside of the book, like going outside of linear closed environments. So I'd like you to maybe say a few words about that. And secondly, I was wondering about this whole transitional hybrid period that we're in. Do you think it's just a temporary situation? I work myself a lot on the 16th century, which is also very transitional. The early print culture, or there's still manuscript culture that will last for another almost 2 centuries, because a lot of writers will only function in manuscript for many decades after the invention of print. And there's a use of oral kind of like ways of writing dialogues and all kinds of like kind of also hybrid ways of using the book. But eventually the printed book as a form became the major form for cultural transmission. So do you think the bytes will just at some point make the books disappear? Because you talk about Postman and ecological media ecology change, and Postman, I don't always agree with him, but he kind of says that we're actually moving toward a post-print, post-literate, very scary kind of world, according to him. So maybe it won't stay transitional forever. So maybe you could say a few words about that.
Yes, thank you. Those are great questions. I mean, the first one is, I mean, the idea of binding. I really, you're right in noticing the paradox with what was happening in the early days of hypertext. That was all about kind of like unbinding and not having the binding as a restriction. So I very purposefully use it to counter that point. So even though some of these works belong to that same era, as a matter of fact, they end up being longer lasting than hypertext literature. And that goes to show, as I was mentioning, kind of like just the need of having certain organizational and structuring purposes that give coherence to the works in a distributed media environment. So I guess the unbinding that was happening at the late 80s and early 90s kind of like did not consider this distributed architecture in material objectual terms. The distribution that was happening was all within the computer, I guess. As soon as there was a proliferation and a distribution of objects that needed a different kind of organizational system, then these mechanisms that can be literary, technical, or bibliographic began to just take shape and emerge or continue to be experimental. So the binding, I really, I take it more in terms of very formalistic, like, you know, it gives a coherence, it gives a form, it gives a structure, and it keeps things together, basically, like, you know, like the stitches. Is it, and you know, I also, I'm a bookbinder, so I am familiar with some of the structures and what they aim to do in terms of, you know, is it an effective sort of binding? Does it really hold things together? And those things that have a very material kind of like sediment become visual, become rhetoric, etc. Now, as for the transitional moment, yes, I agree with you. I don't always agree with Postman either. But I like this idea of ecological thinking that continues to have resonances with Hales and very, very recently with the Multigraph Collective in their interacting with print book. I mean, I think it is a transitional moment, but I don't necessarily know that there is a target. And whether that target is going to be, you know, like full on everything digital, or what is going to look like. As you were saying, past transitional moments have been considerably lengthy, and I wonder. I always try to imagine like what the different stages during that transition look like, and we can go back to the archives and see what they were. But was there something that was indicative that the end game was going to be something or not? And I mean, I don't with these works, I don't like to speculate about, are they really taking us closer to the digital and farther away from the book. I think really the thing that is fascinating about them is how they don't make you choose. They want it all. The authors want it all, and as for readers, I guess we can be greedy with them too, and we want it all there too. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, a fantastic talk, and I'm really struck by your juxtaposition of Pratt and Little, and I hope these thoughts will gel into a question. But what really interested me there is the kind of spatial metaphor that's at work there, and you talk about migrations and translations and these kind of transitions, and these books are linked in with enormous spatial, geographic, infrastructural circulations of resources, of peoples, of dynamics. And I'm just curious, if we want to press on the ecological question, as well as the kind of political migrations that are at play, would you want to push on that further? It seems that thinking about the hybridity of the objects is just scratching the surface. There's so much more than to say about these architectures and infrastructures for these different kind of media transitions.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question, and yeah, it's really just scratching the surface. I agree. Several things to say there. Well, first of all, interestingly, a lot of the writers that have produced these works are migrants themselves. I mean, we saw it with J.R. Carpenter. She very purposefully says it. Belén Gache from Argentina currently lives in Spain. Giselle Begelman, I believe, has lived in the UK for a long time. Another Chilean writer lives in the US, etc. So when I started noticing this kind of like these coincidences, the whole idea of migration hybridity in between started to kind of like gel a little bit better together. But coming back to the other part of your question, the thing about the distributed architectures, that is also very interesting because the things that live on the web, I mean, they have, the regular connections that we know in the web. Cecily was talking about it very rightly yesterday about, do we consider it to be, because of IP addresses, where the different works are stored, where the audiences are, and then the audiences also, kind of like, some of them are more in the electronic literature kind of like realm, others are more in the net art realm. But a very interesting contrast there is that there is, and this is almost altruism, right? There is a much broader circulation of the digital counterparts, especially the ones that live on the web, as opposed to the floppy disks and the CD-ROMs. The book objects have a very limited circulation. They've usually been put out by independent, if not experimental presses, that really just live in a very small ecosystem. So there is like a matter of different scales to the components of the different books. That include distribution systems and business models even that are quite different between them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I was wondering if this hybridization has some back effects. I mean, can we see a book in the same way today, a printed book of the 19th century in the same way today? Is that the same object? Servan, next to me, wrote a book about that, and she speaks about retromediation or something like that. And you were mentioning something like that, the fact that the emergence of the media changes the other. So do you think that beside the corpus you analyzed, what even an old book has changed after this kind of hybridization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you mean an old book that was published,
yes,
let's
before.
say 100 years, or an old book that is published now?
An old book that was published before. I mean, really a retromediation.
Right, yeah.
Another way of saying that, are printed books the same objects today as before, or have they changed the object book?
Yeah, that's why I was making the distinction. So I think there's a retromediation for sure. Yes. So I think they have not changed materially, but our expectations about them or our thinking about them is definitely different. But then the distinction I was making is if we were talking about, let's say, I don't know, Lord Byron's poetry printed 150 years ago, that is, that is the same object that has changed ecologically in terms of expectations and so on. However, that same book printed nowadays is definitely not the same one because it's been, typeset in desktop publishing software. It has been produced through, a series of digital factories, distribution. It's sold on Amazon, etc., etc. This is all the stuff that Matthew Kirschenbaum is researching in his book files project that is on the way now. But that would be a very different object. And there was another part to your question that I forgot. Was it just that? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, this idea of one change impacts everything. It's not the material book does not change, but the place that it occupies changes. Yeah. Thank you.
Another question over here. Yeah.
I was wondering, are you familiar with the genre of items, books called feelings?
I am not.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I thought I just
But it sounds like something that I want to know.
But this is a very different kind of hybrid genre that emerged in the 1980s, 1990s specifically. I have a similar come along with floppy disks for computer games.
Right.
And these were sort of some of them were book objects that were made by the developers for various reasons. One, maybe they just wanted to expand their creative scope. Others were like commercial, so for copyright reasons, they contain protections. Some of them they're interdependent, so you can't play the game without the book.
Yes, yeah. Kind of like this. Yeah. I would love to hear more about them. Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
and if you have some titles, yes, I want them. Thank you.
May I ask a question, actually?
Absolutely.
So I thought one of the really kind of wonderful pieces of your theoretical framework was really kind of looking at Conclini and this idea of hybridity that he kind of brings to the table from the perspective of Latin America. I'm wondering, what do you think is particular about the Latin American context that kind of addresses this notion of hybridity in a different way than perhaps we've seen before?
Well, the thing that I love about it is the tradition of thinking about cultural hybridity in Latin America goes back 120 years, if not more. So that on the one hand, so it's definitely perhaps it's definitely the one of the richest wells of thinking about hybridity in many different ways, in some of which are biracial, some of which are, with the intent of creating a national identity, with the intent of thinking about literary objects, like the case of Rama, etc., etc. So that's one thing. And the other is, because it's so long and it's lasted, there's been many instantiations of the debate, there's also a proliferation of terminology, again, transculturation, acculturation, or this is acculturation, cultural hybridity, cultural heterogeneity, mestiçage, etc., etc. And each one of them responds to a type of phenomenon. And I think that's a correlate of the terminology that we have to explain the current media ecology that I was mentioning before: intermediality, post-digital, post-web, new aesthetic, etc. So I find it very enriching in that sense, that it brings all of these almost models to think about hybridity in general, but hybrid manifestations that is useful to understand more in detail, or to even to discern the differences in the ways that hybridity gets manifested. And yeah, Conclini, what I really appreciate about Conclini is also his view about markets and the economic imperative that is behind that. That I think it's fundamental for this kind of phenomenon. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your conference. To go on with the question of Cecily, I would like to know if it is not also a political question. I mean, I think it's very important to emphasize the role of post-colonial studies, but at the same time, it's a complex question because it is not done in the same way if we talk about Latin American studies or estudios culturales, made from Latin America or made from North America. So, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, from my own perspective, it is definitely a political take. I mean, I was trained in Latin American studies, Latin American cultural studies, and Joshua Lund has this very interesting conceptualization where he says most knowledge is made to fit Latin America, but Latin American knowledge is not applicable to anything else. And I take that as a provocation almost to say, like, no, this is actually broadly applicable to what we're seeing. And really, like, one thing that another parallelism that I like to draw is how what we consider to be Latin American culture nowadays comes from the first globalization in the 16th century. That provides very useful parallels theoretically, as well as aesthetic ones to think about this other sort of this 21st century globalization. Yeah, thank you.
Final remarks, questions, comments? Now we'll continue our discussion tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We have our next plenary, and we'd like to thank Elika one more time for.
Yeah, thank you.